admit all, waiting in the lobby, admit. So we are going through sort of a, what should one say, express course in basic complex analysis. And all these theorems that I'm sort of being very vague of, not vague about, the theorems are precise, but I'm telling you ideas of proofs, and I'm not telling you, I'm not going through all the details of the proofs, because these things are so standard and so simple that the proofs you should be able to understand on your own. And as I say, you must always write out everything with your own hand. Okay? Reading something from a book is not enough. You have to sit down and write the whole thing out. It's almost as if your fingers learn more than your brain, or your brain learns only after your fingers have done the exercise of writing these things out. So I hope all of you will, remember to write this out. Okay, so any questions of anyone? Some more people have joined. I should ask this question again. Any questions so far? No. Okay, let's start. So I should do this, and you can see this, and I think I want to go in the other page first, this one. Yeah. So I'll start with this question that one of you had asked, that how do I get this business about, if it is holomorphic, and then you have a holomorphic function has a primitive. Okay. So why does a holomorphic function have a primitive in a disk? Then of course it has a primitive in any domain, which is simply connected and whatever. So the proof is, I think it's worthwhile going through this proof, because you see how to break things up, and some things cancel with something else. So all this is based on the fact that if you have a holomorphic function and you have a triangle which is contained in that holomorphic function, then the integral over the triangle is equal to 0. Yeah, as I said earlier also, this is slightly confusing, because when I say integral of the triangle, what I actually mean here is integral over the boundary of the triangle. Okay, so this should be the integral over the boundary of the triangle, and this is a abuse of notation in some sense, but anyway, it's sort of standard, so it's okay. So Gursat's theorem says that the integral of a holomorphic function over the boundary of a triangle, the whole triangle must be contained in the domain. The integral is 0. Okay, someone is waiting. Admit. What's happened to my apathy? I can't go back because of this admitting. Are you sure you want to leave? Leave? No. So what did I want to do? I want to minimize this. So it seems that if I admit anyone, I can't go back to this thing. Anyway. So Gursat's theorem says that the integral of a holomorphic function over the boundary of a triangle is 0. Okay. And then the question was that why does a holomorphic function have a primitive? Okay. So having a primitive is a local property, and therefore I do this only on a disk which is sufficiently small or sufficiently large, or whatever you want to say. So let the disk, it doesn't really matter. So I take a disk center 0 of radius 1. Okay. And Z is in that disk, and Z plus H is also in that disk. So I want to say Z plus H is also, H is sufficiently small. So Z plus H in this is in the disk, and you'll see we'll need this over and over again. So I define f of Z, capital F of Z, to be equal to integral over this horizontal line and then integral over the vertical line of fz dz. So it's an integral over this horizontal line. It starts at 0, Z is x plus iy. So it's the integral from 0 to x of fz dz plus the integral from x to x plus iy, that is z. Okay. So what is fz? My claim is that capital F prime is little f. Okay. And why? So you write down fz plus h minus fz. So here I've given all these vertices, I've given them names A, B, C. Where is my C? There is C. A, B, C, D, E, F. Okay. So this is integral A, B, B, D, D, E, E, F. Integral f z plus h, A, B, B, D, I hope I've written it, D, E, and E, F. Yeah. That is integral from 0 to z plus h. F of z is integral AB plus BC. Okay. And this integral AB and integral EB goes away. And I look at integral BD. Okay. But what I know is that integral of BD, integral over BD, plus integral over DC, plus integral over CB is 0. So I'm looking at integral BD. I'm adding integral DC and integral CB. And then of course I have to subtract that. So DC and then I'm adding CD, which is minus DC. Okay. And I'm adding CB and I'm subtracting CB, which is adding DC. So you have CD and BC cancel with these two. And then I have DE and EF. And then I have a BC. So notice that this BC and that BC cancels. And integral over CD. Where is CD? CD is here. So integral over CD plus integral over DE plus integral over EC is 0. CD, DE, EC. Okay. Now I'm adding, what am I doing here? I'm adding DE and EC. Okay. So I must add a CE and what something is happening here. Have I got it right? I hope. CD. There's a DE already here. CD plus DE is already there. CD plus DE is already there. Therefore, I'm only adding and subtracting EC. EC and C. And I have a what? I have an EF, so that is an EF. Now CD, DE, EC is 0. Why is it 0? Because of Gursat's theorem. So you have CE plus EF. CE plus EF. Then I add FC, CE plus EF. So I add, where is my F? I add FC and I subtract FC. So add and subtract FC. So you have a CF there. This sum is 0, so you get integral CF fz dz. That is equal to integral 0 to 1. You take that line segment that joins z and z plus h, which is z plus th. Dz is equal to h dt. And so fh plus h minus f, capital Fx plus h minus capital Fx divided by h is this divided by h of this quantity. The h goes away. I made a mistake. Okay. When I divide by this h is cancelled. So there shouldn't be a 1 by h there. Okay. So maybe I should just multiply it by h is the simplest thing. Okay. And what is the limit of that when h tends to 0? So that is f of z. There's a mistake at the end of this page 31a. I call it 31a because this should come after page 31. And the mistake here is that when I've divided it by h, I don't have an h on this side, so there should be no h on this side. There should be no 1 by h. I put an extra 1 by h here. Okay. So this should answer the question that one of you had. Someone had this question. Does it answer the question? Someone had asked this question last time. I forget who had asked this question, that how do you get this primitive business? And the whole point here is that you're making repeated use of Gursat's theorem. F is holomorphic, so integral over any triangle is 0. And that is essentially Cauchy's theorem. Okay. So this shows you that the derivative of capital F is little f. So capital F is a primitive of little f. Okay. Who had asked this question? Someone had.
So Sonakshi.
Sonakshi, you had asked it. Okay. So now it's clear, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So this is the whole point that, when you have these sets of contours, I mean, when you have this integral over some contour, you should know that I can change that contour in some way without changing the value of the integral. And a bit later on, we are going to show that, you see, all these contours that we had in this particular example were very specific contours. They were horizontal lines, there were vertical lines, and there were these they were straight lines of various kinds, okay? And we are changing one contour to the other. And the question should be that, how much can you change the contours? Okay, so you have a contour gamma 1 and a contour gamma 2. Okay, what you know is that if the function is holomorphic, integral over gamma 1 is equal to integral over gamma 2. Okay, but what do you know if the function, if the function is holomorphic in that space? What happens if it is not holomorphic, if it has poles or something like that? Okay, and the idea again is, the idea you have at the back of your mind is the function 1 over z, the simplest pole that you have, and the contours you're talking about are the semicircle in the upper half plane and the semicircle in the lower half plane. I should have given this as an exercise. That you take the function fz equal to 1 over z and integrate. Did I give this as an exercise? I don't think so. So the exercise is, please write it down. The exercise is, you look at the function fz equal to 1 over z, okay, which is defined on c minus 0. Calculate the integral of f over the upper semicircle and calculate the integral of f over the lower semicircle. Okay, and suppose orientations are consistent. Will you get the same answer? I should have written this down. This is actually very important. Okay, you consider the function. So maybe I'll write it down next time. Consider the, the point you must understand is that the very important examples are usually also the very simple examples. Okay, and you have to worry about these simple examples first. So for example, you have to worry about the function fz equal to 1 over z, and you take these two contours, gamma plus and gamma minus, where gamma plus is the contour which is the semicircle which goes from plus 1 to minus 1. It's the semicircle in the upper half plane, center the origin. Gamma 2 is the excuse me, semicircle in the lower half plane, okay, which goes from plus 1 to minus 1. Okay. And my question is, both these two curves, semicircles, gamma plus and gamma minus, have the same initial point and the same end point. Okay. And can I conclude that the integral, I mean, what we have proved is that for holomorphic functions in a domain, okay. I must write down what we have proved there. If you have holomorphic functions in a domain, okay, then the integral should be independent of the path that you choose. I must go and check what I have written there. I'm sure that I would have made something which will tell you that these two things are different. Okay. So the integral of that function over the integral of 1 over z over the upper semicircle and the integral of 1 over z over the lower semicircle. Okay. These two things are different. So there is something about the fact that you have 0, the function is not holomorphic at 0. So the question is, which curves gamma 1 and gamma 2 can you choose? Okay, and that sort of leads to this idea of what is called simply connectedness. Okay, simple connectedness. A domain has to be simply connected. You can't have a hole in that domain. Namely, C minus 0 has a hole at 0. Okay, and the two curves gamma plus and gamma minus cannot be homotopically changed from one to the other. There is some homotopy that one has to understand. And the theorem we want to prove is Cauchy's. It's the homotopy Cauchy theorem, which we'll come to a bit later on, I hope. Let's see. Okay, so this business is where we were yesterday, and someone had asked this question. And the whole point is that this region going from A, the integral going from ADF, I think it is, and ABC, okay, the difference is just the integral from C to F. Very bad notation again. Okay, because that point upper, the point Z plus H, I should not call it big F because of obvious reasons that I'm calling big F, I'm calling something else. So again, this is a good place to give my little blurb or little comment on notation. Okay, you have to be careful of the notations that you use. You have to be careful of the names that you give things. Okay, I have not been careful here because that point Z plus H, I've given it the name capital F and I've given the name capital F to something else. Capital F of Z is something. So I'm having two different things having the same name. Okay, this is usually very dangerous. You should not give the same name to two different things. And this is what I mean by you have to be careful with your notation. You would like to give different names to different things. Okay, this is the general principle that you will use. Just try to give different names to different things. Of course, if you give different names to the same thing, that is more of a problem or less of a problem? What do you think? So there are these two things, giving the same name to different things and giving different names to the same thing. Had I said this earlier? I'm not very sure. I think I may have said this earlier. Which do you think is worse? Here I've given the same name, capital F, to two different objects, that point and that function. Okay. The alternative is to give different names to the same object. Which is better and which is definitely bad? Which is not so bad and which is very bad?
So
Yeah.
giving different names to same object is very worse.
Different names to say. Why is that worse? This is Arnab speaking, I believe. Yes?
Yes, sir.
It sounds
sir.
like Arnab.
Yes, sir.
Why is
Sir,
giving different names to the same object? Why is that bad?
Sir, you can't distinguish.
Arnab has the name Arnab and Arnab has the name Datta. So I have two different names to the same object. Why is that bad?
Oh, then I can recognize who is calling me. Okay. But when two same name given to different objects, so
Do you understand that giving the same name to different objects is much worse? Okay, because you don't know what you're talking about when you're talking about that name. You don't know what you're referring to when you're talking about that particular name. Giving the same name to different objects is very bad. Giving different names to the same object is not that bad. Okay, it has other difficulties that you'll end up with getting too many names. Okay, so there's a balancing act to be made, and you will come across this. I mean, I may be talking, you may think that I'm talking philosophy. Yes, it is philosophy, but it is very relevant in mathematics. Yeah,
sir,
someone
we
saying
can,
something.
yeah,
Who?
sir, we can prove that A is equal to B, but we cannot prove that A is not equal to A.
Something like this. Okay, you have to be careful. Okay, giving names is important, and very often people don't pay enough attention to the fact that different names should be given to different things. Okay, and the extreme example was in I think we had a student in our department in the university some 10-15 years ago. We had two students who had they had the same first name, they had the same second name, and they had the same middle initial. Okay, the only saving grace was that that middle name was different. Okay, this is the extreme case, and there were two different people, it was not the same person. So but the middle initial was also the same first name, same last name. They're very common names all over India. The same middle initial, but the middle name was different. It was quite funny at that time. Okay, so anyway, this is serious stuff that you must be careful in the names that you give to objects. Okay, and this confusion about what the name refers to should never occur. Now, having said this, there's also a flip side of the coin, that you may have very different objects, okay, but in some sense they are similar. And if they are, then you would like to give them the same name. And very often you do. What is the example? What is the preeminent example of objects that are different for which you give the same name? What is the most glaring example that you know in mathematics? Do you understand that the word determinant, the name determinant, you use a name determinant all the time? But do you understand that the name determinant means many different things? In what manner?
Are you referring to the construction, sir?
No. I mean the actual object. When you say determinant, you just say determinant. Okay? But the word determinant refers to many different objects. What do I mean by that?
I'm not sure if this is what you mean. Maybe determinants of linear maps versus those of matrices.
No. That's not what I mean. Okay? Do you understand that determinant should be determinant sub n? Are you talking about a 3x3 determinant? Or are you talking about a 4x4 determinant? Are you talking about a 23x23 determinant? All these determinants are different functions. The domains are different. The definitions are different. Yes. So when you talk about determinant, you should actually be talking about determinant sub n, by which you mean the n determinant. That means the determinant of n by n matrices or n dimensional vector space. Okay. But you never talk about determinant sub 3, which is the determinant of a 3 by 3 matrix. You never talk about determinant sub 4, which is the determinant of a 4 by 4 matrix. And you know that determinant of a 4 by 4 matrix is different from a determinant of a 3 by 3 matrix. Okay. So in that context, the same word determinant is given to an infinitely many class of objects. Okay. But you see, it is very awkward to talk about determinant sub n. Okay. So one has to be careful of the names that you give. You should give different names to different things up to a certain limit, because if you try to be very precise in your notation, you will create more confusion than what you actually want to do. So, I mean, this is my little bit of philosophy, which is always good to have. Okay. And it is quite relevant to what we are doing now. You must be careful of giving names. Different names should be given to different objects. But there are times when you give the same name to a family of objects. For example, determinant. You always just call it determinant instead of determinant sub n. Okay. And why am I saying all this? I'm saying all this because of this mistake that I made, that I put a capital F there and a capital F here. They should not be the same F. Okay. So on the one hand, there is a very famous quote by Shakespeare about names. What is that quote? Does anyone know it offhand? No. So please think about it. It is relevant here. There's a quote, extremely famous quote from Shakespeare about giving names. Okay. Anyone know what it is? What am I talking about? Yeah.
Rose by any other name would something along those lines? Is that
Would what?
I don't remember, but is this
A
the one?
rose, yes, this is what a rose by any other name would smell just as sweet. Okay. It does not matter what name you give. It does not matter whether I call that a capital F or I call it a capital Z. Okay. The rose will smell just as sweet. Okay. Giving names does not really matter. But anyway, that is the reference I was thinking of. You have to be careful of the names that you give. Okay. And this is a good place to think about it. So this is why, I just realized it now after writing this, that this point Z plus H, I should not call it capital F because there's a capital F here. Okay, so already I wasted too much time. So we were here somewhere. I said something about this reflection business. Okay, and then the Schwartz reflection principle, and then you can extend it. So all this I had done last time. Okay. And then there were these exercises that I had mentioned last time, which I hope you would have gone through. The first exercise is that the Fourier transform of the function e to the minus pi x squared is itself. Okay. This is a consequence of Cauchy's theorem, because you take this region and take the limit, and you're going to do many exercises like this. I hope both Sagar and Kaushik will spend some time doing many exercises like this, and you will, if you look up any book on, if you look up any book on complex analysis, including Stein and Shakarchi, you will see that there are lots of, and we'll come to, I'll say a little bit more about it again today. Okay. A lot of very important integrals are calculated using Cauchy's theorem and the residue formula, which I have not yet said, but we'll come to the residue formula pretty soon. Okay, so there are, and by the way, the exercises, the good thing about the exercises in Stein and Shakarchi, using this, evaluating these integrals, is that all these examples that they have given there, all of them are important because they arise naturally in different contexts. So why does e to the minus pi x squared arise? All of you know that this is the normal distribution, and the point is with a factor. The normal distribution, you'll put a factor in front. But the point is with this normalization, e to the minus pi x squared is its own Fourier transform. Okay, so this is an example of a function which is its own Fourier transform. The integral, I'm not going to go through it. I've written it out. It's there in the book. But the point is that this example is important. Okay, and you know by Cauchy's theorem, the integral is 0. The integral over this region is 0 because the function is fz is e to the minus pi z squared. It's a holomorphic function. I've written analytic. Anyway, integral over this whole thing is 0. Integral over the vertical lines tends to 0 as r tends to infinity. And therefore, this integral is essentially equal to the integral of the whole thing is just the integral over that. Okay. IR plus IR minus, and very easy to see. Okay. And then therefore integral of the rectangle is 0, but you know the integral of the real line is 1. That is what I've written here first. And therefore the integral of the second thing is the Fourier transform. And therefore you get that integral e to the minus pi squared, pi x squared, e raised to 2 pi I x psi is equal to e to the minus pi psi squared. Have I written that? Yeah. Okay. Fx is its own Fourier transform. This is another important integral which we are going to use a bit later on. And therefore the function you are considering is 1 minus cos x is, look at e to the iz over z squared. X squared becomes z squared. Cos x is e to the ix plus e to the minus ix by 2, the real part of that. Okay, so you have to look at something like this. And again, this is the region that you take. You go around this singularity at z equal to 0. Therefore, the integral is 0. Integral of the big line, big semicircle tends to 0. Integral of the smaller semicircle, you can calculate what it is. Okay. And therefore, putting these pieces together, you get what you want to get. Okay. Now, we are going to come across many examples like this. And it is worthwhile going through all these examples. Of course, you know, from the engineering point of view also, this particular business is quite important because you actually want to calculate various integrals, and to calculate various integrals, you use this theorem of Cauchy. Okay. You also use residue theorem, and we'll come to the residue theorem in a little while. But there's sort of a immediate, extension of these ideas. So suppose you have a holomorphic function in a domain omega, and you have a 0 of that function, lemni z0. And suppose f is not identically 0. Okay, then that 0, okay, that 0 is a 0 of finite multiplicity. What do I mean? There exists an n such that fz is z minus z0 to the n0 gz, where g is holomorphic and g at z0 is not 0. That means near z equal to z0, okay, g of z very near z equal to z0 is some non-zero number, and therefore f looks like z minus z0 to the n0 into something that is very small, something that is not small, I should say, okay, because g of z0 is not 0. And why is this? Okay, what we know is it's analytic, therefore you have a power series expansion, and f of z0 is equal to 0 means that a0 is 0. and f is identically 0, I made another mistake here. I've written f identically 0 means not all the ans are 0. What should this be? This should be f not identically 0 implies not all the ans are 0. Okay, so I forgot to put the cross sign here. F not identically 0 implies not all the ans are 0. All the ans are 0, that means f is 0. So you take the minimum of all those n's such that an is not equal to 0. Every non-zero subset of integers has a least element. So fz is looking like this because all the previous ones are 0. You can pull out a z minus z0 to the n0, and this a n0 is non-zero. Okay, and therefore it's written like this. So this is just n0 is unique. And in this case, Z0 is a zero wave of multiplicity N0. So it's just standard business. What is a deleted neighborhood? You remove the point Z0. Okay. And I say f has a pole at Z0. If this function f tilde, okay, 1 over fz and 0 if f0, this is holomorphic. Okay. On this. And it is a pole, the pole must be isolated. You can't have secret, and there are no other zeros. If f has a pole, then there exists a nowhere vanishing holomorphic function h and a unique n0 such that fz is this hz is nowhere vanishing, and fz is this. I have to be slightly careful here. I should say if f has a pole at z0, isolated pole at z0, then in a neighborhood of z0, so I should be slightly careful here. I should say in a neighborhood of z0, f can be written as z minus z0 to the h0 h of z, where h is nowhere vanishing. And this is the same idea. Okay, this function is nowhere vanishing. It's no big deal. And therefore, if f has a pole at z0, it must look like this. There must be this a minus n. You see, this function g of z, this business here, is analytic. Okay, and it's non-zero. So that it has a power series expansion. And then I just have to multiply it by z minus z0 to the minus n0. So it will come out to be looking like this. Okay. So if f has a pole at z0, then f of z is a expansion like this. And this first part, which is the singular part, is also called the principal part of f. And this coefficient a minus 1 is called the residue of f. Okay, the residues are important. You would like to calculate residues of many things because why? Okay, so a minus 1 tells you a great deal about f. What are these a minus 1s? Okay, so I'm doing this and now I want to come to this. So this is the next sheet I'm starting. That previous thing I'd done. Okay. 31A, page 31A should come after page 31. And 42 I've just done, so 43. So f has a pole at z0, you can write it in this form. Okay, this is called the principal part of f, which I call pz, and a minus 1 is called the residue. Okay. Now a minus 2 over z minus z naught, okay, this has a primitive in that deleted neighborhood. Okay, d by dz of a minus 2, that's at constant, d by dz of 1 over z minus z naught to the minus 1 is minus 1, that to the minus 2, and therefore I put a minus 1 sign. Therefore a minus 2 over z minus z naught has a primitive in the deleted neighborhood, and therefore the integral is equal to 0. Okay. I have to be probably slightly careful here also. But anyway, it doesn't matter. All the other terms also have a primitive. Okay. And therefore, if f has a simple pole, then a minus 1 is the simple pole, means that the order of that pole is 1. F has a pole of order n, then a minus 1, which is the residue. What have I written here? I've written something wrong. I've written something wrong here. It should not be a minus 1. I've told you what a minus 1 is. A minus 1 is this limit. Okay. So a minus 1, it should be a of n. Okay. A minus n is equal to that. So watch this line. I made a mistake on this page 44. It should not be a minus 1, but it should be a minus n. Okay. No, it's correct. What I've written is correct. It is a minus 1. The a minus 1 is the coefficient is z minus z0 to the n minus 1, and I want to get that. And therefore, I have to take n minus 1 derivatives of z minus z0 to the f. This is correct. I haven't made a mistake. It's correct. Okay. A minus 1 is the n minus 1th derivative. When you take n minus 1th derivatives, all the previous terms become 0. And you take n minus 1 derivatives of this last term, z minus z0 to the n times gz. You'll still get a z minus z0 surviving. Okay. And when you evaluate it at z minus z0, okay, the term is 0. So if the residue is just this term. I should write here d by dz of n minus 1 z minus z0 to the n fz 1 over n minus 1 factorial evaluated at z equal to z0. So page 44 on this fourth line, there is a omission which I shouldn't have made. It should say a minus 1 is the residue of f at z0 is equal to d by dz to the n minus 1 of z minus z0 to the n fz into 1 over n minus 1 factorial. The trouble is this thing on the right hand side is a function of z. The thing on the left hand side is not a function of z. So what I want to do is take this function, the n minus 1, the derivative of blah, 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 and evaluate it at z0. I'm trying to go too fast, but anyway. Okay, so this a minus 1 is residue is equal to the n minus 1 derivative of that evaluated at z equal to z0. Okay. Note that if k is not equal to 1, then integral of this is 0. If k is equal to 1, this integral is a. Remember the contour I'm always taking is a positive contour. And if gz is analytic, gz dz is equal to 0. And when you put these things together, if you take this contour C, so you have a region and you have a point Z0 and F is analytic. When you remove Z0, Z0 is a pole of F, isolated pole of F. That means F is analytic in that whole region. And then the point is that you can calculate the residue by integrating F over this region C. Why? First of all, F has that series, this is called a Lorentz series, okay? Finite Lorentz series. F is written like that, and therefore, if you take the integral of F over C, C is supposed to omit, Stein-Shakarchi calls this the keyhole contour, okay? It also shows, so if you're going to call that as your keyhole contour, okay, it also shows, it also reflects a generation gap. Yes, now I'm pretty sure that most of the people in this class, when they think of a key to a lock, I'm sure none of you think of a key to the lock which has a hole like that. Because all the keys, essentially all the keys for today's locks do not look as if they will fit into something like that. Do you know what I'm talking about? Do you know what I'm talking about when I say that?
Yes, sir.
How do the keys
Yeah,
nowadays
we still have
look
these
like?
things at home where
Ha.
you had things, dagger-like things dropping from the top, and there's a long rod on top.
Ah, okay.
That's
So
this
those
keyhole
keys,
function, right?
that is your classic keyhole. Okay, because the thing you put that in is the keyhole for those keys. Whereas nowadays the keys that you get and the locks that you get, okay, are never like that. They're sort of more jagged. Or the more extreme cases when the when the when the locks and the keys, when the keys don't have jagged edges, but they have circular depressions. Do you know what I'm talking about? Have you seen these Europa locks or something they're called, and now it's quite common. The keys have a pattern of circular depressions in them. Okay. And those circular depressions are what move the. Do you know what I'm talking about?
No, sir, I've never seen that circular kind of lock. I know
There's
the
a
jagged
key
lock
which has this head here, and it has this sort of thing sticking out here. And on this thing sticking out, which is what you put in the lock, the key has a series of circular depressions on both sides. Okay. And now, therefore, it gets more difficult to duplicate. Okay. And now a lot of the main door keys in lots of houses now are in fact like that. Okay. Anyway, that's by the way. The key, everyone I hope has seen the key, and the keyhole is like this. Okay, so this is called a keyhole business. The function is holomorphic and everything outside this keyhole. Therefore, the integral over the boundary of the keyhole is 0. But these two little bits, the horizontal lines, cancel each other out. So I only have the integral over the big circle and the integral over the little circle, which goes in the opposite direction. Therefore, if you want it to go in the right direction, you must put a sign there. And what is the integral over the little hole there? It's sort of very standard business that you take this up. And when you take the integral, you just get a minus 1. Okay. So this is the standard argument that in this region, okay, the function is holomorphic. Therefore, the integral over the boundary of that region is 0. Okay. That means the keyhole boundary, the integral is 0. And as these horizontal lines get smaller and smaller, these two integrals over that upper horizontal line and the lower horizontal line, they cancel each other out. So you're left with the integral over the big C minus the integral over the little c is 0, and you evaluate what the integral over the little c is. It gives you a minus 1. Okay. And therefore, if f is a holomorphic function on an open set containing a disk except for a pole at finitely many points, then the integral of that is equal to the sum of the residues. Okay, why? Because instead of having a key with one keyhole, you have a key with more than one keyhole. I mean, you have a region with more than one keyhole. Yeah. Yeah. So by the way, all of you are at the age where you might have your own bank lockers, or you might have gone with your parents to a bank locker to take out the gold from the bank locker when your sister or brother is getting married. Yeah. And if you notice that in the bank lockers have how many holes? How many holes do the keyholes in a bank locker have?
Sir, 2, sir.
2 or 3. Sometimes they have 3. Yes. So anyway, the point is you have seen these things with some of the things have 2 holes and some of them have 3 holes. I've seen things with 3 holes. Anyway, the point is that you do have the keyholes in bank lockers are always like this, as far as I know. I have not yet come to those electronic keys for bank lockers. So anyway, this is the standard thing. And therefore, you have this residue formula, which is sum over 1 over 2 pi f z dz is residue of f at zj, where you have these are poles of f. Okay. And therefore, you get application. So you look at this F, look at its poles, find its residues, and that is the integral of F over gamma, where gamma is a closed contour that such that those poles are in that closed contour. Now, yeah, what is in and what is out? Okay. One has to be sort of worried about the meaning of in and out. Okay. But the point here is that we are going to be considering very nice contours. Yeah. I hope you understand that there's a problem with what is the meaning of in and out. Okay. In general, is there a problem with what is in and what is out? So you see what I have said is that this integral is the sum of the residues where Z1 to Zr are the poles of F in gamma. Okay. And I really did not need to have these inverted commas here because everything we're going to talk about are going to be bounded regions in C in the complex plane, okay, which have piecewise smooth or which have smooth boundaries, okay. In which case it is clear what is meant by in. But even to show that it is clear that in makes sense, that is a theorem. Do you know what that theorem is? What is the meaning of in and out?
Are you talking about orienting?
No, I'm not talking of orientation. So you have a circle, you have a point inside the circle and a point outside the circle. My question is, you see, if you have a circle,
Jordan curve, that's what you're talking about.
so what you need is actually a non-trivial theorem, which is called the Jordan curve theorem. Okay. So it's not needed here because we're talking about very nice curves. Okay. But the statement is that if you take this, you only need continuity. You take a continuous curve in R, in C, okay? Then take any point which is not on the curve, okay? Then it is either, do I need differentiability? I don't think I need differentiability. Then whatever, the plane minus the curve has two components, which have each component has the boundary has that curve as its boundary, and there is a component which contains infinity, means which is an unbounded component and a bounded component. Okay, so that is not an easy theorem to prove. Okay, one needs some algebraic topology, basic fundamental group. And I hope you people someone will have a look at the proof. Maybe it will be done in one of the later on AFSs when you do the second topology course. But the point there is that you can define in and out. And you must understand that this notion of in and out has something very special to do with the geometry of what we are talking about. So for example, is this notion of in and out well defined on the sphere? You take a curve, differentiable curve on the sphere. Okay. What is in and what is out? Do you think you can define it? Do you understand what I'm asking? For the case of a plane of the complex numbers or the plane R2, I take a differentiable curve and then I have this notion of what is in and what is out. Okay. The thing that is out is the connected component, unbounded connected component. What is in is the bounded connected component of the complement. Okay. Can I say the same thing for a sphere? Can I say the same thing on a torus? What is the question I'm asking? Is it understandable?
Yes, sir.
So what is the question?
Jordan curve, does it hold in more general? I mean, what kind of
Not
spaces?
more
does it-
general. I'm talking about very specific things, namely, for example, in the sphere, on the sphere, or on the torus. Do you think it holds? So, for example, if I draw a circle on the sphere, yeah, we have drawn circles on the spheres. That is what all this, what the Mobius transformations were about. You draw a circle on the sphere. Can I tell you what is inside that circle and what is outside that circle? So do you understand that you cannot? Okay. You cannot say what is. This is the same question of that this is there in Indian mythology also, or many other places. You have a lion running around the whole city, and you want to protect yourself from the tiger. And what do? What can you do? Okay. I mean, why is a tiger in the zoo a safe thing to be? Okay. Is the tiger inside a cage or what? The tiger in the zoo, is the tiger inside the cage or what?
Outside the cage, I think what you're trying to say is you can separate the tiger with you can put the tiger.
No. My question is, this question is what is in and out. So when you have the tiger in the cage in the zoo, okay, is the tiger in the cage or are you in the cage?
The tiger, right?
Why? You are also in the cage. Do you understand that?
The cage is separating.
The cage is bounded. So the bounded area, you say you are inside the bounded area or outside?
Yeah, both are bounded. Both areas are bounded. One might be, 2,000 times more than the other, but both are bounded.
How, sir? Aren't you saying you're
the
in...
area of the sphere, the area of the earth, the surface area of the earth is finite.
Okay.
So it's not boundedness. And I don't care whether one is much bigger than the other.
Yeah, no, I was thinking that you're in R3 without that cage.
No, on the sphere. I'm talking on the sphere. Okay. So, I mean, the point here is that what is in and what is out depends on the topology of the object that you're talking about. There are similar problems when you're on the surface of a torus. Okay. If you take a circle which sort of goes round, you cut the tire. You have a tire and you cut tire tube and you cut the tube. Okay. It does not separate the surface of the tube. Number one. Okay. And number two, again, if you cut it in the other way, then it will separate the surface of the tube, but you can't say what is inside and what is outside. And there's a, so what do I mean by saying that there's something similar in Indian mythology? What am I talking about?
The Lakshman Rekha.
Not Lakshman Rekha. Something else. It's a Rekha. Yes. It's a Rekha which goes around, line which goes around. And someone goes around that line in the other. Just think about it. There's a corresponding story in Indian.
Oh, the Ganesh surrounding. Ganesh and Parvati.
Not Parvati. Ganesh and
Karthik.
Ganesh and Kartikeya did what?
They were told to run around, travel around the earth, and whoever came back first would love them.
Very good. I hope all of you will understand that there is some analogy between that and this business of separating this business of the Jordan curve theorem. Okay. So I hope everyone knows what you're talking about. If you don't, then you can share it on. It's Ganesh and Kartikeya say going around the world. Okay. And what do they go around? Okay. So anyway, so the point here is that what is in and what is out is not a very easy thing to say in general. But when we are talking about the complex plane, because these curves we are talking about are differentiable curves, okay, what is in is the obvious thing that you will do when you look at it, okay?
Sir, can I ask you something?